Good Sunday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for April the 16th. Today we are reading together in Numbers chapter 8 and Numbers chapter 9. Thanks for taking some time to read along in the Bible with me today. Let me get the text up on the screen for us. Again, we're in Numbers chapter 8 and Numbers chapter 9 today. Two relatively short chapters. We'll put them together because they both deal again with the Levites. There's, as you can see on the screen, there's going to be the lighting of what is going to become known as the menorah. Also the consecration of the Levites, and that's going to take us into the carrying out of the Sabbath, or excuse me, not the Sabbath, the Passover in chapter 9. So let's begin reading here in Numbers chapter 8 for today. Numbers 8, verse number 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and tell him, when you set up the lamps, the 7 lamps are to give light in front of the lampstand." So Aaron did this. He set up its lamps to give light in front of the lampstand, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. This is the way the lampstand was made. It was a hammered work of gold, hammered from its base to its flower petals. The lampstand was made according to the pattern Yahweh had shown Moses. Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Take the Levites from among the Israelites and ceremonially cleanse them. Do this to them for their purification. Sprinkle them with the purification water, have them shave their entire bodies and wash their clothes, and so purify themselves. They are to take a young bull and its grain offering of fine flour mixed with oil, and you are to take a young bull for a sin offering. Bring the Levites before the tent of meeting and assemble the entire Israelite community. Then present the Levites before Yahweh and have the Israelites lay their hands on them. Aaron is to present the Levites before Yahweh as a presentation offering from the Israelites so that they may perform Yahweh's work. Next, the Israelites are to lay their hands on the heads of the bulls, sacrifice one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering to Yahweh to make atonement for the Levites. You are to have the Levites stand before Aaron and his sons, and you are to present them before Yahweh as a presentation offering. In this way, you are to separate the Levites from the rest of the Israelites so that the Levites will belong to me. After that, the Levites may come to serve at the tent of meeting, once you have ceremonially cleansed them and presented them as a presentation offering, for they have been exclusively assigned to me from the Israelites. I have taken them for myself in place of all who come first from the womb, every Israelite firstborn. For every firstborn among the Israelites is mine, both man and animal. I consecrated them to myself on the day I struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, but I have taken from the Levites in place of every firstborn among the Israelites. From the Israelites, I have given the Levites exclusively to Aaron and his sons to perform the work for the Israelites at the tent of meeting and to make atonement on their behalf, so that no plague will come against the Israelites when they approach the sanctuary. Moses and Aaron and the entire Israelite community did this to the Levites. The Israelites did everything to them that Yahweh commanded Moses regarding the Levites. The Levites purified themselves and washed their clothes. Then Aaron presented them before Yahweh as a presentation offering. Aaron also made atonement for them to cleanse them ceremonially. After that, the Levites came to do their work at the tent of meeting in the presence of Aaron and his sons. So they did to them as Yahweh had commanded Moses concerning the Levites. Yahweh spoke to Moses in regard to the Levites. From 25 years old or more, a man enters the service in the work at the tent of meeting. But at 50 years old, he is to retire from his service in the work and no longer serve. He may assist his brothers to fulfill responsibilities at the tent of meeting, but he must not do the work. This is how you are to deal with the Levites regarding their duties. Chapter 9 of Numbers. In the first month of the second year, after their departure from the land of Egypt, Yahweh told Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, the Israelites are to observe the Passover at its appointed time. You must observe it at its appointed time on the 14th day of this month at twilight. You are to observe it according to all its statutes and ordinances. So Moses told the Israelites to observe the Passover, and they observed it in the first month on the 14th day at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. The Israelites did everything as Yahweh had commanded Moses. But there were some who were unclean because of a human corpse, so they could not observe the Passover on that day. These men came before Moses and Aaron the same day and said to him, "We are unclean because of a human corpse. Why should we be excluded from presenting Yahweh's offering at its appointed time with the other Israelites?" Moses replied to them, "Wait here until I hear what Yahweh commands for you." Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites, when any one of you or your descendants is unclean because of a corpse, or is on a distant journey, he may still observe the Passover to Yahweh. Such people are to observe it in the 2nd month, on the 14th day at twilight. They are to eat the animal with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They are not to leave any of it until morning or break any of its bones. They must observe the Passover according to all its statutes. But the man who is ceremonially clean but the man who is ceremonially clean is not on a journey and yet fails to observe the Passover is to be cut off from his people, because he did not present Yahweh's offering at its appointed time. That man will bear the consequences of his sin. If a resident alien resides, or if an alien resides with you and wants to observe the Passover to Yahweh, he is to do it according to the Passover statute and its ordinances. You are to apply the same statute to both the resident alien and the native of the land. On the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and it appeared like fire above the tabernacle from evening until morning. It remained that way continuously. The cloud would cover it, appearing like fire at night. Whenever the cloud was lifted up above the tent, the Israelites would set out. At the place where the cloud stopped, there the Israelites camped. At Yahweh's command, the Israelites set out, and at Yahweh's command they camped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they camped. Even when the cloud stayed over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites carried out Yahweh's requirement and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud remained over the tabernacle for only a few days. They would camp at Yahweh's command and set out at Yahweh's command. Sometimes the cloud would remain only from evening until morning. When the cloud lifted in the morning, they set out. Or if it remained a day and a night, they moved out when the cloud lifted. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or longer, the Israelites camped and did not set out as long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle. But when it was lifted, they set out. They camped at Yahweh's command, and they set out at Yahweh's command. They carried out Yahweh's requirements according to his command through Moses. And that is Numbers 8 and Numbers 9. Again, much of the focus here is on Aaron and the Levites and various aspects of their service, their consecration, but also does focus on the Passover and kind of the, we'll call it the migration pattern of the Israelites as they are in the wilderness. Beginning here in chapter 8, though, we have this instruction concerning the 7 lamps that are in front of the lampstand. Really what this is talking about is a menorah. Maybe that's a something that we are familiar with. We often associate it with modern day Jews who carry out, I believe it would be Hanukkah, would be the festival that they would light this in, or other festivals as well. You think of it as the lamp that's got many arms put out from it. So it'll be 3 on each side with 1 in the middle. That's basically what we have described here. And we can read more about that in Exodus 25 and Exodus 37. Here, though, the specific instruction is that they are to give light in front of the lampstand. They're to put it in front of the lampstand, just as Yahweh had commanded. And many people think that what this is referring to is making sure that the light is pointing towards the table of the presence, where the showbread was, the 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And the symbolism behind this sin is that light is always upon the bread, just as Yahweh is always to be with the people. This was something that the Levites were to concern themselves with and make sure that they were taken care of on a daily basis. From there on, though, we start talking about the consecration of the Levites. There is a chiastic pattern to this particular section, verses 5 through 22. It goes A, B, C, D, E, and then D, C, B, A. So if you look at it, this text mirrors each other, but the center portion of it, the E portion, would be verse number 17. For every firstborn among the Israelites is mine, both man and animal. I consecrated them to myself on the day I struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt. Remember, beginning with the Passover, there is this principle that was to remain true within Israel for all times concerning every firstborn belonging to Yahweh. And what that would mean in its most literal terms, that every firstborn should be sacrificed to Yahweh. But of course, that's not what he wants for his people literally be sacrificed. So instead, he has given the Levites to be those that are given to him, to belong to him, to serve him. in order for them to represent the firstborn, to be living sacrifices for him. But even within this text, we see that there were actual sacrifices that were needed. There were two bulls that were offered, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering for purification and consecration. So here again is something that we talked about previously, in the fact that they had to actually, let me back up, in 5 through 19, I think, would be the chiastic pattern. Verses 20 through 22 talk about the obedience of the people. But even here, as we talked about previously, all firstborns belong to God. The Levites were given as those who represented the firstborns, but even for them, there had to be actual sacrifices made in order for them to be purified and consecrated before Yahweh. Verses 20, 21, and 22 are very important because they just show the obedience of the people, taking seriously what Yahweh has said here within this text. The Levites came to do their work in the tent of meeting in the presence of Aaron and his sons. So they did to them as Yahweh had commanded Moses concerning the Levites. They recognized this was an important command given by God. These were instructions that needed to be heeded, and they were carried out by the people. Now, to finish out chapter 8, we see further instruction concerning kind of the workforce of the Levites, who would be doing the various types of work, whether it be the avodah type of work or whether it be the avoda type of work, kind of this heavy labor that needed to be done as they moved the tabernacle from place to place. It says that they were from 25 years old to 50 years old. They were those aged men were to do this work. Once they got to 50, they had to retire from this type of work, but then they would start doing a different, or they could help contribute to the different work, the guarding type of work. The Levites were the guardians of God's sacred space, so they could help the brothers. It says they could help the brothers with the mishmeret type of work, but they could not be doing the avodah type of work, the heavy lifting and such. Now, if you remember back in chapter 4 and verse number 3, the instruction says that they had to be from 30 to 50. So that's a legit difference. What's the deal here? Some chalk it up to a scribal error. Others would say that this 25 years refers to a 5-year apprenticeship that the Levites would undertake before they got into the work. Others just see this as a development over time, because this actually probably takes place before the time of chapter 4. And maybe at one point it was 25 years old, but then they realized they didn't need that much of a workforce. They moved back to 30. I think even later on in the history of Israel, the ages even moved back to 20. Think about it. Unfortunately, if we think about the Levites, there are times throughout their history where a lot of them died because of disobedience to God. So maybe they had to lower the age in order to find more men to work in the service. We're just not exactly sure what the issue is here, why exactly this discrepancy, but it certainly is there and something for us to keep in mind. Moving on to chapter 9, we have the observance of the Passover, the second Passover. This will be in the first month, on the 14th day of the second year in which they are out of Egypt, and they are given the instructions to perform this Passover. So Moses told the Israelites to observe the Passover, and they observed it on the first month, or in the first month, on the 14th day at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai. They did everything just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. Again, this is good. This is whenever Israel's at her best, is whenever she is listening to Yahweh, observing Yahweh's instructions, and following them faithfully. And certainly that is a lesson for us to learn. Now, beginning of verse 6 and going through verse 14, there's this issue of, well, what happens if there's an issue that prohibits us from partaking in the Passover? The example here is some men who are unclean because they had been around a human corpse. They say, well, it just stinks that we were unclean. We still want to participate in this. Again, they saw the significance of participating in the Passover. So what can we do? Moses, instead of just giving an answer right away, he takes some time and says, let me see what Yahweh says on this matter. Just wait and let me see what Yahweh commands you. So Yahweh gave them the instruction that they could do it on the second month, on the 14th day. So a month later, those who might be unclean or those who might be away from Israel, they could come in and they could participate at the Passover at that time. So there was, in a sense, a secondary Passover for them to observe if they were prohibited from taking the first. Now, in verse 13, if there's someone who just decides, Passover, no big deal, I'm not going to offer that this year, that was a big no-no. That was something that Yahweh took very seriously, and that person is said to be cut off from his people, which oftentimes whenever that's described, that's somebody who's going to die pretty quickly after the fact. So this was a very serious issue. Now, verse 14, I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure on how to read verse 14. If this was if they were to celebrate the Passover according to the actual time, or if their time to observe the Passover was at that secondary time. I'm not exactly sure. But here in verse 14, if an alien resides with you and wants to observe the Passover, he has to do it according to the Passover statute and its ordinances. You are to apply the same statute to both the resident alien and the native of the land. So maybe that's referring to the normal Passover day. Maybe reading it again now, that's probably what I'm leaning towards, since it applies to the resident alien and the native of the land. That's my guess. Not exactly sure, but just want to take note of that not only do we have unclean people that are thought of by Yahweh in order to take the Passover, but even those aliens who resided among the people, they could partake of it as well. Those who wanted to honor Yahweh, Yahweh made provisions for them to do so. The chapter ends beginning of verse 15 with the cloud, and really these verses, they really just say one thing. When the cloud was over the tabernacle, the people stayed. When the cloud left the tabernacle, the people left. That's basically all these remaining verses talk about. That when God's presence, when the cloud, which was his presence, was over the tabernacle, the people stayed still. They remained there. But when the presence of Yahweh took off, they followed. They went where they were directed to go. Again, this is good obedience from the people. They camped, verse 23, at Yahweh's command, and they set out at Yahweh's command. They carried out Yahweh's requirements according to his command through Moses. Again, Israel was at her best when they listened to the commands of God. When they observed the tabernacle the right way, they were blessed. When they observed the consecration of Levites the right way, they were blessed. When they observed the Passover the right way, they were blessed. When they followed Yahweh's instructions, they were blessed. And friends, that's a good example for us too. If we want to be blessed, we simply need to obey Yahweh. We need to obey our God. Listen to what he says. Follow Jesus wherever he might lead. And in doing so, we will be blessed. I'm very excited to be with everyone here in just a little while for our Bible studies and our worship assembly. We will be continuing our study through the Gospel of Mark, beginning in chapter 3 and verse number 7, and finishing out that chapter 3, looking at the Messiah's real family. There's opposition to Jesus in the preceding verses, and I believe verse number 6 from others. And then Jesus is going to start selecting his apostles. He's going to be questioned by his real family. He's going to be accused of being in league with demons by his opponents. And then finally, some people are going to say, well, here's your family, Jesus. Jesus says, I'm going to tell you who my true family is. We're going to study that today from Mark chapter 3 and verses 7 through 35 here in a little while. Hope you can join us then. Thanks so much for tuning into this reading, everyone. Have a great rest of your Lord's Day. Take care, and God bless.